Life is Art is dedicated to bringing you insightful commentary on art, culture, and life. To support the podcast, feel free to make a monetary donation or purchase our official Life is Art merchandise at the link in the description. Your donation helps us to reach a wider audience and helps us to gain traction in the world of social media. Thank you for your viewership and support. Life is Art. Art moving at the speed of life. Life moving at the speed of art. Well, I come from a background that dealt with diversity and equity in the arts when I was executive director for inclusion in art. And I think there are a couple of things that have changed with me. I think sometimes we politicize the term diversity, and we want diversity within a certain box. And if you don't really check off those boxes, then you're not free to be diverse in the way that you want to be diverse. And I think every crusade that an activist takes, eventually you can tell when a movement has overstayed its welcome by it becoming, a parody of itself. And again, the organization itself hasn't turned into a parody. That's definitely what I'm not saying, because that's, as a founding member of that organization, the mission was a very noble one, but the climate changed. And I think what happens when the climate changes is people become advocates instead of crusaders for something. They become advocates of what they believe, and these echo chambers do form. And the idea of diversity, especially in the arts, it ends up becoming something where everybody has the exact same voice. It's just that some of those voices are black, some of those voices are white, some of those voices are male, some of those voices are female. But they echo similar sentiments about certain ideas. If we're talking about diversity in the purest sense, then we want to consider the opinions of everybody in the arts, and I'm speaking strictly in the arts. We want to consider the opinions of everyone who is a creative. And a lot of times, artists don't want to be they don't want to be involved in political conversations outside of their chamber, where everybody already agrees with them. And I think they adopt those circles because visually those circles are diverse. They adopt those circles as circles of diversity, even when the freedom of thought isn't necessarily as supported as the cosmetic um, circumstance of people being multiracial. Multiracial uh, doesn't doesn't denote diversity of thought, of concept. And art is political a lot. So to not have that layer of inclusion in a conversation from different perspectives means that I think the arts have taken a step back as far as the understanding of what diversity is. And I think at some point there has to be a shift in what we believe diversity to be. Um, as it stands right now, it's it's kind of like a quote I heard: "You can be diverse as long as you believe what I believe, as long as you think what I think, as long as you support one or two of these things within this box, and as long as you come from a place that I understand." And that's not really, it's not really being taught, how to communicate and how to endeavor to understand other people. If you're not like me, we shut down the conversation. And I think that's permeated the arts to a certain degree. Um, that's a random question to toxic masculinity. And I guess that's pointed right at me, huh? Because I'm a male. No, but seriously, I don't think in terms of toxic masculinity. I think in terms of toxic behavior. If you're if the way that you carry yourself is of a toxic nature, it really doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman. The one thing that I think that we've done is I believe that we've already decided who is going to be the bad guy in this conversation and who is going to be the hero in this conversation. And I don't think enough weight is distributed all the way around as far as the behavior of everybody that's sharing sharing the landscape between one another. I think toxic masculinity is easy to label and talk about because right now within the the crosshairs are men. And when you talk about Me Too, which started out as something really good and much needed, um, it too took on a parody form of itself, and eventually everything that a man did was toxic. And I think we have simplifications of what masculinity is based off of the need for it. When we're at war, we love masculinity. Um, when protection is needed, we love masculinity. When violence is needed for the benefit of someone, whether it's to defend your family or to defend your country, we need it. However, when every aspect of who you are becomes toxic, it becomes difficult for a man to maneuver at all. The very nature, and this is the way that society is beginning to present it, the very nature of being a man, for some weird reason, has become toxic in itself. So I think we need to look at the value of what men bring to the table, and I think we have to stop looking at men as predatory because I'll be honest, statistically speaking, most men are not rapists. Most men are not chauvinistic. Um, it just so happens that there are men that are chauvinistic. There are men that are rapists that are in power, and I think we conflate that for all men, and we get on board because consensus is speaking loudly. And I think men have stepped back from the table and they're not speaking at all. There's a major disconnect from society that's happening in the male community. And if you're told enough that you have no value, if you were told to concede to every other group except the group that represents you as a man, then eventually you take your ball in and you stop playing. And I believe that we're probably going to see a backlash to and a consequence to going that route. At some point, we have to acknowledge that whether male or female or just whatever, if you're human, you're capable of toxic behavior. Um, so I would caution society to reevaluate what it even considers toxic masculinity. A lot of times, conversations from men that make women uncomfortable are considered toxic. So that freedom of thought is also handicapped. That freedom of opinion and preference is handicapped, all while many of those groups exhibit the very behavior that they associate with one group. And I think that's unjustly um, pinned to that group. I guess at some point I'm going to be asked about art, but this isn't one of those questions. Marriage. I've been married twice. As an artist, I can tell you, marriage is difficult. It's difficult for anybody that's in love, because you're dealing with an entire human being. That being said, um, marriage today looks nothing like marriage as I understood it. And I guess I can only speak anecdotally and from my own personal perspective. I am not a big proponent of marriage as it exists right now. And the reason I'm not is because society's changing, and you have to question, um, what exactly are you getting married for? In the past, there were reasons that men and women got married. And a lot of that had to do with society. Um, Society created a climate to where most of the time a man was a breadwinner and women were raised and groomed to be wives. Now you have women outpacing men. And if women are outpacing men, you get to see the true nature of what it means for a woman to want to be married, like her true reasons, and it has nothing to do with need. A lot of marriages, we talk about going back to the good old days. There's a lot of people that say, we need to get back to marriage and we need to get back to that. A lot of it in certain ways was, um, in the minds of many women, particularly feminists, was very oppressive because you operated out of a sense of needing someone. When you need someone, it's not much different than going to work. I need this job, and you may not necessarily like the job. I don't think anything has changed with that perspective. It's how many people are going to say I hate my job, and I'm going to say something that's very controversial. I don't know many people that are legitimately honest with me that are happy with their spouses. Um, if anything, their lives are just completely so intertwined that they no longer have a choice. And when you become a person who is independent, you start doing things because you want to. And I think that's changed the dynamic of what a woman will stand for in a marriage, and quite frankly, now what a man will stand for. I just don't think it has to be a toxic hatred for one another to even explore those changing dynamics. But personally, yeah, the brave artist will never get married again. And my reasons could be different than another man's reasons, could be different than, why many women are not wanting to get married as well. It could just be we don't personally live. For me, I don't see a society where I see the benefit of it. Um, and I won't get into some of the shortcomings as far as what a man of of status can lose. There's an emotional component to it, which I'm more concerned about because I'm not a rich person, and there's a financial component that, I'm not wealthy, but wealthy men are now putting their money into trusts. They're putting their properties. They don't own anything, and many many women who are seeking provision no longer need a man to provide the provision for them. So we're seeing an honesty in marriage that we had in dating and the idea of marriage that we hadn't seen in the past. And I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it is a confirmed thing that's happening. So, with every shift and every change, there's also a consequence that comes with that. Um, are we talking race and art, or are we talking race in general, or just race all the way around? You know what? I'll just talk about my observations of race all the way around. Normally, when we talk about race, we talk about, um, the dynamics between. I believe we're talking primarily about the dynamics between blacks and whites because we have a unique history with one another. Not necessarily other minorities coming over. And when I say blacks, I mean foundational blacks. We don't. We have a relationship with white America that other groups don't have. And I think that conversation is unique and requires, a different kind of attention. If you're an immigrant looking to make your way in this country, then you have a certain amount of hope. If you're a person that was the descendant of slaves, you came in at a deficit, and who you were was largely stripped away from you. The The problem is, in order for there to be progress between blacks and whites, because what we're seeing right now is a growing divide and a growing willful divide as far as self-segregation between groups, because we don't identify with one another. The remedy would take these ingredients. White people being martyrs is probably going to have to end. You can only beat yourself up so many times before you realize that your self-evisceration is not making anything better for African Americans. And African Americans have got to decide honestly whether or not they hate white America. And it's a weird relationship. On one hand, there's a dependency upon the structure that was facilitated by white America, and we're talking from an economic standpoint. We're talking from a cultural standpoint. And I know there are black people that would say, what do you mean from a cultural standpoint? We have our own culture. Well, what you have is a rendition of white culture it's based off of white norms. It's based off of Judeo-Christian norms. You just happen to switch some things around in your expression. So the idea of assimilation is a very, very negative thing in the minds of many African Americans, even though every day they do a form of assimilation that preserves a certain type of Black authenticity. But what's not considered is whether that Black authenticity is valued in circles where the economic power is. The way that I think Black people can keep themselves intact in the way that they want to and have an identity that they're comfortable with is they have to build their own infrastructure, which, it's happened in pockets. You had Black Wall Street, you had things like that. But, even Black Wall Street was built off of concepts of Western culture. It was essentially the Black version of society that mirrored white society because white America wouldn't let Blacks be involved. But now that uniqueness, you have to ask yourself, if you're not going to assimilate, then do you have the infrastructure to be who you are and have the things that you want without involving yourself with other groups of people? Right now, the answer is no. Largely, a lot of African Americans have been consumers. And if we're not building, and I'm saying it from a general standpoint, 13% of the population, it's just like any other group. The top 1% that creates business and entrepreneurship, it's even smaller within the Black community by proxy. It's a small population. If you're going to assimilate, you're going to have to look at the possibilities of who you can be. And I'm probably going to speak a little longer on this because for whatever reason, it's a hot button. And assimilation, if you look at people that have assimilated, they tend to do better from a monetary standpoint. And monetary value is, I think, worship of monetary value is something that kills the Black community all the time. So you have this dual existence of wanting to be unique and preserve your own expression while wanting the same thing that mainstream, largely white established society wants. You can't have the same thing but operate in a different way. There's exceptions to the rules, but for the most part, that's not what happens. As far as the arts, African Americans in art, again, it's a reflection of life. You have to build your own infrastructure if you want somebody to value your vision. There are white people that collect Black art, but largely that's not the case. People tend to collect those things that they identify with culturally, that they identify with um, they identify with visually as well. So if you're going to build a supportive base, they have to your circles as African Americans, they have to value what you do and build those economic institutions of support in the same way that the mainstream establishment has built those same avenues for an artist to survive. Uh, and I do find a lot of times, we come in and we want to change the rules. It's like, well, why is this considered good, and why do I have to live up to your standard? Well, you have to live up to the standard of the facility that you're trying to access. The only other choice is the same thing as the practical economic um, model that I was pointing out, is you have to build institutions that support your vision, that support who you are as an artist, that support what you consider to be um, adequate professionalism. If the establishment has created a standard and you're the person that's trying to gain access to uh, that that entity, that structure, then you're going to have to make a decision. Are you are you prepared to be a black artist that will be rejected if you don't adapt to the structure of that institution? Or are you willing to are you going to cultivate something to where you don't need that structure? And I think that's where as far as my observations of race and society and art, I think they're mirror images of one another. um I don't know that AI can replace authenticity that comes from live creators, human creators. I don't know. And it depends on which way society goes. Society is becoming largely one that does not value authenticity in art. And we want immediate gratification from art, which means any flat surface will do. If the art that's created by AI looks the same as the art created by a living human being, then and costs less because there's nobody to pay. The idea of art for an aesthetic value is an area that could go either way. Some people still like authenticity. Some people still like the idea of the craft behind the work. But there are some people that simply enjoy the vision of the work. And we're talking about a more practical society. This means the manner in which it's made is of no concern to the person that's simply looking to hang art in their home, is simply looking to acquire something of beauty. Where it was rendered doesn't matter to them. And if that population outpaces the population that enjoys authenticity, that enjoys art with a history that's associated with an artist, if those circles don't grow, then we are going to see a value shift in what visual artists do. And I think right there, we're going to have to really, really look to see how the arts is growing. And that's how we can determine what happens. The survival of creativity has always been a subject, even during our most creative times. I think in the arts, it was more about a perpetuation of something that we couldn't conceive going away, but we wanted to make sure that it didn't. And I think what makes this time a little bit more unique is that creativity and art is looked at more as a luxury in a time where we've become a society of survivors. And if you're busy surviving, then a world of beauty doesn't mean anything to you. You don't care about the structure and the visibility of how something looks um, such as a house. You know, it has a roof on it. You don't care if it's an ugly color, if it's terracotta, if it's traditional um, traditional roofing. All you care is that it keeps you dry. And I think that way of thinking has permeated our society to the point to where visual beauty doesn't mean much. Most of us don't have time to stop and smell the roses and smell the flowers. Most of us live in a time of go, go, go. We see our coworkers more than we see our actual families. So if you were going to grow new art collectors and art appreciators, you would have to make a climate to where people have time to do that. If it's not a product that aids in something practical, then many times it's not deemed as something that has to happen right at that moment. Um, and you know, beyond time, we are breeding a society that doesn't necessarily have the same appreciation for aesthetics or thinking. And art challenges you to think. We've conditioned people through social media to pick the quickest route to the result that we want. And when you do that, it takes away part of the journey of becoming a whole person. If you don't pick up things along the way because point A and point B are so closely linked together, then you miss a very crucial point, or a very crucial part, rather, of the journey of gaining knowledge, gaining appreciation, and gaining an understanding for something. Um, if you can click a button, it takes away the value of that journey. It also takes away from the history that a person might have created en route to to the conclusion of being on that path. So the arts is going to have to find a way to reestablish itself as a practical entity to do something practical for people outside of look pretty or make them think. The arts is either going to have to reroute people's mindset, which is a position that I completely support, or it's going to have to learn how to dummy down. Hence, we have bananas being taped to walls. Um, we have, um, and this is just an opinion, we have trap music that's devoid of any real soul. We have auto tune and um, musical frequencies that appeal to the anxiety of people. And subconsciously, we absorb all of that. And if we decide that creativity has no value, which we are deciding that as society is becoming less and less creative and more visually lacking, we don't understand the psychological effect that that has on us as human beings. Um, there's something about being in front of art that you can't put your finger on, but you understand when that component is taken away. It's sort of the cherry on top of life. And a lot of times, you don't know when something that is every bit as creative and artistic is there, but you notice the absence of it, but you can't put your finger on it. And those societies, you know, think about it. You have a society where everybody now has two or three jobs. It's the gig generation. If they don't have time to appreciate these things that we're talking about preserving, they don't get preserved. The older generation is now aging out as far as collecting, and they no longer no longer show up for to collect. You know, as a matter of fact, you can only be an advocate for art as a collector, as a buyer, until you run out of wall space, which inevitably is every art collector under the sun. What's not being done is this part of that culture is that it's not being handed down. It's not being promoted as something of value. As a matter of fact, it's looked at as something that the kids are going to have to figure out what to do with because they don't want it. And the reason they don't want it is because that part of who that parent wasn't instilled in them. If you don't instill the value of certain virtues and legacy, then the children have no reason and have no point of reference as to why something is valuable outside of that painting was made by mom or dad. And it becomes a glorified version of something that you put out for a garage sale. So the survival of creativity is going to vastly depend on the value that the aging out tastemakers, culture makers place on art, on creativity as they go out. If they simply age out without creating any point of reference, then the next generation is going to be consumed by practicality and the rat race, which is largely being adopted as the norm. And if that's all a person knows, that's who they become. So I think what happens as far as the survival of art is completely in our hands, but there has to be a level of effort and responsibility as far as at least making the case for the importance of creativity. Wow, that's a question that I assume, people would expect me to be politically correct and run from it and talk around the answer. I'm gonna be very honest about the answer. Um, when you ask a question like whose side you're on, you've gone on ahead and simplified the entire idea of liberalism and conservatism. We're talking about it like a football game. The side that I'm on is my side and what's best for my family and what I believe is best for the country. So in other words, I am politically fluid. At this point, I'm independent, and I don't subscribe to a side. I subscribe to the politics of sides, and I'll expound upon that. There are things that I am very conservative about that are not necessarily social things, and there are societal things that I'm very liberal about and very progressive about. So I guess you could say I'm an amalgam of, well, what I'm working to be is an amalgam of the best parts of those sides. And the one thing that I have found is that as people get older, they tend to become conservatives, more not conservatives, but more conservative in their way of thinking. And the other thing that kind of disturbs me is some of the most conservative people claim to be liberal, and when you ask them why they're liberal, they have no idea why they're liberal. They have no idea about the principles and the policies supported by by Democrats, by liberals. And the same could be said on the conservative side. Sometimes it's just generational. And for me, many years it was generational. And I started looking at policy versus personality. And I think when you do that, you have a certain freedom to operate and you stop looking at labeling yourself as something and start looking policy to policy who you are. So if you ask me about, my stance on wars, I may lean more liberally or I may lean more conservatively. If you ask me about my position on the arts, the same thing. If if we demonize what we believe, what people believe politically, then we create this canyon between us because we have more things in common than we do things that are different. And I'm going to say something that people might feel is controversial. When you focus on your differences, like, I'm so different, I'm so unique, I'm so this, I'm so that, to the point to where you change the very definition of what you perceive a human being to do, it becomes different. Becomes difficult for a person who perceives human decency and humanity to relate to you. So there's got to be a certain degree of homogeny to our society for cohesion without losing those unique characteristics. Politically, I tend to call everybody out, and it's not because I'm trying to make sure one side doesn't feel over represented as far as the critiques. I do it because both sides are full of ideas that deserve a critique, that deserve to be examined, that deserve to be um, um, called out every now and then. The unfortunate thing is that a lot of people think political affiliation equals a virtuous human being. And when you see the same behavior exhibited and you call it out, many times there are people that get angry with me and they ask me if I'm a conservative, or if I say something in defense of more progressive minded people. There are conservatives that question, well, why is your stance that way? The difference is this, and I'm going to be very honest, and this in no way has anything to do with me um, in my political affiliation. I wanted to be as neutral as possible, and that's got its limitations. But when you want to dialogue, there's room for change. There's room for change of opinion, because a person that can't change their mind, that's not a person that you can really do anything constructive or beneficial with. I find that I am shut down more by the allegedly liberal minded person than I am the conservative person, which historically that hadn't been the case for me. And I think society is on the left. I think the left hand side of society has cultivated this culture of emotional helplessness and outrage to offset the fact that they don't want to engage with a person that has a different opinion. And that goes back to, some of the things that I've said about echo chambers, to where everybody in the room, if you challenge a policy that five people support, they look at you with this goofy um, deer in the headlights. Oh my God, I can't believe he said that look, rather than just asking me, how did you arrive at that point? The left's ability to absorb information without outrage is sorely lacking right now. And if I have to be that guy that that you need me to say this in order to feel like it's fair. Conservatives, um, they tend to make messiahs out of their leadership, and they subscribe to a way of thinking that is not necessarily as flexible. For me, I don't really have a problem with who defines marriage as what. If we're all living by the same rules as what governs marriage, who cares? That's a very liberal idea, but there are staunch conservatives that will willfully say, "Hey, I recognize marriage to be between a man and a woman," and a lot of that is based off of spiritual beliefs and things like that, which I'm not necessarily beholden um, to a degree. A majority of our morality does come from religious sources, dogma, books, writings, teachings, proverbs. Even the atheist gets their moral compass from something that many of them, and which is funny to me, because if you don't believe in God or the devil, why are you railing so hard against God? Um, for them to get their same moral compass from those sources is very funny to me. Um, and as far as being able to absorb another individual and their opinions, I find that the right is becoming more open than they have been in recent times. And I think sometimes we get to the point to where we recognize that we stereotype the parties. Um, the parties have sort of changed, and that I think that the Democrats, to a degree, have not recognized that change, which is why the election was lost. I don't think that election was lost so much because Trump had a stranglehold on society. I think that it was lost because the Democratic Party was unable to voice who they were outside of um, outside of feminism and transgenderism, which those are components of our society that are every bit as valuable as any. The problem is that the conversation never reached across the aisles to include people in that conversation, or to provide policies, visual policies. They may have had on paper. If you look at the laundry list of things that they wanted to do for Americans, they may have included those populations that they didn't talk about. And I think that was a blind spot. And I think placing emphasis on um, on specific groups instead of figuring out how we can all progress as a whole hurt them greatly. Not to mention the minimalization of African American men and white men, middle aged white men, as far as being a voting bloc. Um, I do believe that the America that they want doesn't exist right now. And many times they express the America they want and project it onto the voting population, and they don't get the results that they want because it's not a stance that's speaking to all Americans. On the flip side, the conservatives will follow their leader, their messiah, to the edges of the earth, um, without question. And I think they believe that solidarity is necessary to hold on to the position that they have. And I don't know that they've examined. I think they've done a better job, and this might hurt a lot of liberals' feelings. I think they're unified on core values. I think they're unified on what they believe America should look like. I think they're decisive. Can you be wrong and decisive? Of course, you can be wrong and decisive. Um, but the I think that unifies the Republican Party, and I also believe that solidity, as far as what they believe to be true and what they believe to be false, has has a narrative that is steeped in something that they have tried to dress as solid. I believe the progressive mind state is fluidity is a virtue, and to a degree it is. But if you're not able to define exactly who and what you are, even if you know who and what you are, if you can't convey that to a public, it results in landslide losses. I think people um, want something concrete. We live in a time where jobs are not concrete. We live in a time where relationships aren't concrete. We live in a time where society isn't concrete. And subjectivity really isn't what Americans are on right now. They are on definites. And it's up to those people that vote to figure out if those definites are factual. And that's where the the critique begins, because in some of those situations it's not a definite. It's just more rhetoric. Both parties are very susceptible to rhetoric and not doing anything. Um, Largely, there's a shift with black people as far as voting historically Democrat, because now we're starting to look at policy, and I think some of the votes are cast against the party out of anger, more so than out of support of the opposite party. There's got to be a center again, and I think where I exist is at that center of where we understand each other on this at this fundamental level. everything else that makes us unique should be treated as the icing on top. There has to be some kind of cohesion in society. And my vote, if I vote at all, will go towards the candidate that has a more cohesive idea that includes me and who I am, rather than a party that talks. And I'm not saying that I'm picking any party, but any party, left or right, that does not address the needs of the population that I come from. If I'm not considered, then I can't consider you. The party that considers more people honestly, openly, and with that commitment is the party that I would want to be aligned with. At this point, I don't necessarily see that on either side. So, baby, we got to roll independent. And I think that answers the question as far as, my, what am I, a liberal or a conservative? Long story short, I'm a wild card. And you might want to say something that actually has to do with me. You might want a policy that has to do with a majority of Americans, not just pre-selected populations. If you do that, then you have my allegiance. But I think it's bad that we have to hold our leadership, we have to hold their feet to the fire, because this is something they should want to do. You should want to do good by your um, by the people that support you and put you in office. And I can safely say I haven't been really impressed by anybody. There's one person that I was impressed by, but they're not even a candidate at this point when we talk about the future election, which isn't that far away if you think about it.